Whole cities were wiped out. Civilizations crumbled. And nobody knew what had happened.
Welcome to WatchMojo, and today we're counting down the deadliest years in human history.
People by the thousands fled the cities and towns or the countryside, only to find death there, too.
1520. The 16th century was a time of major upheaval for the indigenous people of the Americas, as European colonizers began flooding into their lands. And as anyone who took 8th grade history knows, the deadliest things the invaders brought with them weren't their weapons, but their diseases.
The Aztecs had never been exposed to deadly European diseases before, and that left them uniquely vulnerable to the contagion.
Smallpox arrived in what is now Mexico in 1519, and it ravaged the population. From 1519 to 1520 alone, it killed between 5 and 8 million people. The virus spread rapidly across Central and South America, wiping out entire families and villages. Aztec Emperor Cuitlahuac died from the disease after just 80 days on the throne. The devastation smallpox caused to native North and South Americans is incalculable.
Fast-spreading, painful, disfiguring, and incredibly deadly, the smallpox virus spread like wildfire through the Aztec capital. Soon, more than 50% of the city's population had died.
1783. The eruption of the volcano in Iceland on June 8th has been called one of the most devastating environmental disasters in European history. It spewed lava over 4,000 feet into the air and continued for months.
This lava actually poured down out of the gorge here to the south and covered the plains in front of the mountains which you see here.
But the lava wasn't the biggest problem. The volcano dumped hundreds of millions of tons of poisonous gases into the air, including sulfur dioxide and fluorine. This went on for 8 months.
By the time Laki finally stopped erupting in February 1784, it had emitted 8 million tons of fluorine, a highly toxic chemical.
The smoke and toxins spread all over the globe, causing extreme weather events and poisoning land and crops. It killed millions of horses, sheep, and cows and caused widespread famine.
The ingested fluorine killed 80% of Iceland's sheep and more than half of all cows and horses.
Around a quarter of Iceland's population died, and the effects were felt as far away as Africa, India, Japan, and the Americas. 1929. The Wall Street crash in October 1929 kicked off the Great Depression, one of the most devastating times in U.S. history.
Wherever you looked, boys and girls, men and women, were wondering what was ever going to happen to them.
Unemployment and homelessness skyrocketed, and even those who kept their jobs had their wages slashed. Over the following years, thousands of banks closed their doors, and hunger and malnutrition affected millions of people.
I remember looking behind the markets, the garbage cans, looking for head lettuce.
It's difficult to estimate how many died as a result. On top of that, the number of people who took their own lives jumped by more than 20%. This major economic downturn affected Europe too. Germans turned to the Nazi Party for relief, while in the Soviet Union, Stalin's agricultural policies caused a major famine. It was a tough time to be alive anywhere in the West.
People that were out of work, they were hungry, that they looked at fascism or communism, and that gave them a chance, an opportunity maybe to climb up the ladder. Maybe there's something wrong with our system. Maybe we ought to do that.
2020.
China says the number of people infected by a mysterious respiratory virus has more than tripled over the weekend.
We don't blame you if you're trying to block this year from your memory. The World Health Organization estimates that the COVID-19 pandemic killed more than 3 million people in 2020 alone.
As of today, authorities confirm more than 2.7 million cases in New York City. The actual number of cases is likely much higher.
It also caused a massive global recession and forced millions of people out of work. Amidst all of that suffering, you might have forgotten that 2020 was also a catastrophic year for the climate. Huge wildfires raged across Australia and the western U.S., and major tropical storms impacted much of North America. For many, 2020 was the worst year in living memory.
I'm 55 years old and I've never been homeless. It's going to be rough.
1600. The Huaynaputina volcano erupted in southern Peru on February 19th of this year. Unlike the eruption of the Laki volcano, this one lasted less than 24 hours, but the effects were devastating. The explosions launched around 30 cubic kilometers of rocks into the air, and at least 11 villages nearby were buried almost instantly, killing over 1,000 people. Even more died from the earthquakes and floods that followed. Tons of ash and smoke were dumped into the atmosphere, reducing the amount of solar energy that could reach the ground. Over the next 2 years, countries around the world experienced record low temperatures, and many crops failed. It's believed to be the largest volcanic eruption in the recorded history of South America. 1945. The final year of World War II is one of the deadliest. As the Allies gained ground in Europe, the Nazis began evacuating prisoners. Hundreds of thousands of Jews and Soviet and Polish civilians died on these death marches and in concentration camps during this time. The US continued its assault on Japan, and a single firebombing of Tokyo in March killed around 100,000 people. In August, Americans dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing somewhere between 150,000 and 250,000 more people. The death toll of 1945 is rivaled only by 1943. That year saw some of the bloodiest conflicts, as well as a famine in British India that killed between 1 and 4 million people.
এটা যে কত স্যাড, কত কি শেষে বাইরে যেতাম না আমরা ভয়। রেশন কার্ড only for rich people or able people.
1816.
It's April 10th, 1815, and in just a few moments, the sun is going to disappear.
On the island of Sumbawa, in what's now Indonesia, a volcano called Mount Tambora began erupting in 1815. The most violent volcanic eruption in recorded history. It spewed up to 45 cubic kilometers of rock and ash into the atmosphere.
Mount Tambora erupts with a boom that can be heard over 2,000 kilometers away.
Several smaller eruptions had occurred over the previous 8 years in the Caribbean and Pacific Ocean. The effects of all of these combined to trigger a volcanic winter. 1816 was widely known as the year without a summer.
Literally one of the darkest periods in human history.
The extreme cold caused flooding in some parts of the world and droughts in others, and people in the US reported ice and frost in July and August. This wild weather resulted in widespread crop failure and starvation across Europe, the Americas, and parts of Asia.
Nations struggle with epidemics, and artists craft bleak tributes to these seemingly apocalyptic times.
1918. When a global pandemic breaks out during a world war, you have a recipe for massive human casualties.
With a large scale of infections going unreported, no one was prepared for the deadly pandemic it would become.
The Spanish flu didn't actually originate in Spain. The first known case was recorded in the US in March 1918. Over the next 2 years, it would infect nearly 1 out of every 3 people on Earth and kill somewhere between 17 and 50 million.
The flu spread in America. Even public health officials began to lie about the state of things. Like Philadelphia's public health director Wilmer Cruson, who in September of 1918 declared, "No concern whatever is felt."
World War I also killed around 17 million soldiers and civilians, and the devastation it wrought made the pandemic even worse. Stressful living conditions, poor sanitation, and the mass movement of people created a breeding ground for other diseases too, like the epidemic of encephalitis lethargica that killed another 500,000 people.
To put things in perspective, more than 16 million people died in World War I. The Spanish flu killed at least 50 million people.
1348. The plague had been around a long time before it reached Europe in 1347.
Plague is an infectious disease caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. It mainly affects rodents and spreads by way of insects.
When it did, it spread like wildfire, causing the horrific pandemic that came to be known as the Black Death.
Killed with astonishing speed. In a few days, sometimes even less.
Between October 1347 and June 1348, it moved from Sicily across northern Europe and into England. It also hit northern Africa and the Middle East. Without treatment, 80% of people infected with the bubonic plague die. And it's not a pleasant way to go.
People by the thousands fled the cities and towns or the countryside, only to find death there, too.
It's hard to know for sure how many people it killed, but historians estimated that up to 50 million people succumbed to the disease. That includes between a third and half of the entire population of Europe and a third of the Middle East. Before we continue, be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos. You have the option to be notified for occasional videos or all of them. If you're on your phone, make sure you go into your settings and switch on notifications. 536.
Just under 1,500 years ago, something terrifying happened to the world's climate. Something nobody could understand.
Volcanic winter's no joke. It's the reason historian Michael McCormick called 536 the worst year to be alive. We still don't know what caused this period of global cooling, but evidence points to a major eruption in Iceland that carried smoke and ash across Europe, the Middle East, and into Asia. Scholars of the time wrote of a strange fog that dimmed the sun for more than a year. Crops failed, causing an unparalleled global famine.
Whole cities were wiped out. Civilizations crumbled. And nobody knew what had happened.
To make matters worse, an outbreak of the plague started in 541 and spread across Europe and the Middle East. In some cities, it killed up to 5,000 people per day. Whether you were rich or poor, the mid-6th century was an incredibly difficult time to survive.
It was a catastrophe that affected millions and millions of people all around the world.
Which of these years do you think would be the worst to live through? Let us know in the comments.
In the US alone, 675,000 people would die from the flu. That's more American deaths than American soldiers who died in World War I. It's more than all the deaths of American soldiers in the 20th century combined.
Did you enjoy this video? Check out these other clips from WatchMojo, and be sure to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified about our latest videos.